The morning mist hung low over Windsor Castle as Lance Corporal James Mitchell adjusted his red tunic for the final time before taking his position at the King George IV gate at 24 years old. James had been serving with the Coldstream Guards for 3 years, but the honor of standing guard at Windsor Castle still filled him with pride every time he was assigned the duty. The ancient stones of the castle seemed to whisper centuries of history, and James knew that he was now part of that continuing story. James had grown up in a small mining town in Wales, where his grandfather had regaled him with stories of military service during World War II. Those tales of duty, honor and service to the crown had inspired James to enlist the moment he turned 18. His journey from the coal-dusted streets of his hometown to the manicured grounds of Windsor Castle felt like a dream he was still afraid he might wake up from. The early October morning was crisp and clear, with golden leaves scattered across the cobblestones from the ancient oak trees that dotted the castle grounds. James could hear the distant sounds of preparation as the castle staff began their daily routines. But his world had narrowed to the precise execution of his duties. His bearskin hat sat perfectly positioned, his rifle held at exactly the correct angle, and his eyes focused straight ahead. With the unwavering attention that had been drilled into him during countless hours of training, what James didn't know was that this particular morning would be unlike any other in his military career. King Charles III had arrived at Windsor the previous evening for a private weekend retreat. Seeking respite from the demanding schedule of royal engagements that had filled his calendar for weeks, the king had specifically requested a quiet morning walk through the castle grounds, away from the formal protocols and constant attention that usually surrounded his public appearances. The king's security detail had conducted their usual sweep of the grounds at dawn, ensuring that all posts were properly manned and that the usual high standards of protection were in place. Detective Inspector Sarah Williams, who had been coordinating royal security for over a decade, had personally briefed each guard on duty about the king's presence, though she had emphasized that this was to be treated as a routine assignment with standard protocols observed as James stood at his post. He was acutely aware of the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. Windsor Castle wasn't just a tourist attraction or a historical monument. It was one of the official residences of the British monarch, and every person who stood guard there was entrusted with protecting not just a building, but the very heart of the British constitutional monarchy. The thought both humbled and energized him. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the castle courtyard. James had been at his post for nearly 2 hours when he noticed unusual activity near the private royal apartments. Additional security personnel had appeared, their subtle positioning indicating that something significant was about to happen. James maintained his rigid posture and forward gaze, but his peripheral vision caught glimpses of movement that suggested preparation for an important arrival or departure. At 9:47 a.m., James heard the distinctive sound of footsteps approaching from behind him. The measured pace and the quiet murmur of voices suggested a small group moving with purpose, but without the urgency that would indicate an emergency. James's training had taught him to process these auditory clues while maintaining his ceremonial stillness, cataloging potential threats or important developments without compromising his position. The footsteps grew closer, and James could distinguish what sounded like 3 or 4 people walking at a leisurely pace. There was something about the quality of the conversation that reached his ears. The tone was relaxed, almost conversational, but carried an undertone of authority and respect that suggested this wasn't just a routine castle tour or staff meeting. James's peripheral vision caught a glimpse of well-dressed figures approaching from his right side, but his training kept his eyes fixed straight ahead. He had been taught that royal guards were to remain focused on their primary duty of vigilance and protection, regardless of who might pass by or what conversations might occur in their vicinity. The discipline required to maintain this focus, especially when curiosity was natural, was one of the most challenging aspects of ceremonial guard duty. As the group drew nearer, James could hear fragments of conversation that seemed to be discussing the castle's history and the morning's pleasant weather. The voices were cultured and spoke with the kind of measured cadence that suggested people accustomed to being listened to carefully. There was something familiar about one of the voices, though James couldn't quite place it while maintaining his required focus and attention. The group paused somewhere behind James and to his left, and he could sense that they had stopped to observe something or perhaps to continue their conversation without the distraction of walking. James remained perfectly still, his breathing controlled and his attention split between his primary duty of vigilance and his natural human curiosity about the distinguished visitors who were clearly examining the castle grounds with knowledgeable interest. What James couldn't see was that King Charles III had stopped with his small entourage to admire the precise bearing and obvious dedication of the young guard at his post. The king had always held deep respect for the men and women who served in the various guard regiments, understanding better than most the combination of military professionalism and ceremonial perfection that their duties required. The king's private secretary, who was part of the small group, had begun to quietly brief His Majesty on some upcoming appointments. but the king's attention seemed focused on observing the guard's exemplary posture and obvious commitment to duty. There was something about the young soldier's bearing that struck the king as particularly impressive. Embodying the very best traditions of the British military, Detective Inspector Williams, who was also part of the group, maintained her professional alertness while allowing the king the informal morning walk he had requested. She was constantly scanning the environment for any potential security concerns, but she was also aware that these moments of personal connection with the people who serve the crown were important to His Majesty. James continued his vigil, unaware that he was being observed with such careful attention by the very person he had sworn to protect and serve. His concentration remained absolute, his posture perfect, and his commitment to duty unwavering. The morning sun had climbed higher now, warming the stones of the ancient castle and creating the kind of quintessentially British autumn scene that had been repeated countless times over the centuries. The sound of movement suggested that the distinguished group was preparing to continue their walk. But instead of the footsteps receding into the distance, James heard them approaching his position more directly. His training had prepared him for various scenarios, including interactions with senior officials or members of the royal household, but nothing had quite prepared him for what was about to happen. The footsteps stopped directly in front of him, and James could sense a presence immediately in his line of sight. His peripheral vision registered a figure dressed in country attire, tweeds, and a well-worn jacket that spoke of someone comfortable with informal dress but carrying him. James felt his heart rate increase slightly as the figure stepped directly into his line of sight, but his training held firm. He maintained his unwavering gaze straight ahead, his rifle position perfect, and his breathing controlled. The person standing before him was clearly someone of significant importance. Given the respectful distance maintained by the accompanying group and the quality of attention being paid to this interaction, what James couldn't allow himself to acknowledge, even internally, was the growing recognition of who was standing before him. The distinctive features, the bearing, the unmistakable presence all pointed to a reality that his mind struggled to process while maintaining his ceremonial duties. King Charles III, the sovereign he had sworn to serve and protect, was standing less than 3 feet away, observing him with what appeared to be genuine interest and respect. The king studied the young guard's face, noting the obvious youth but also the maturity and dedication evident in his bearing. There was something about this particular soldier that reminded His Majesty of his own young adulthood, when duty and service had seemed both daunting and inspiring. The king had always believed that the strength of the monarchy lay not in its pageantry or traditions, but in the character of the people who served it at every level. Detective Inspector Williams maintained her position at a respectful distance, her trained eye constantly scanning for any potential security concerns while allowing her sovereign the informal interaction he clearly wished to have. She had witnessed many such moments over her years of service, and she understood that these personal connections were often the most meaningful aspects of royal duty for King Charles. The king's private secretary, Michael Harrison, stood quietly nearby, his tablet ready should any urgent matters require His Majesty's attention, but he too recognized the significance of this spontaneous moment. These unscripted interactions often revealed the most genuine aspects of royal service, both from the crown's perspective and from those who served it. After several moments of silent observation, King Charles made a decision that would surprise everyone present, including his security detail. Instead of continuing his walk or offering a simple acknowledgement, he chose to break the formal protocol that typically governed such encounters. What happened next would be talked about in military circles and royal households for years to come. "Good morning, guardsmen," the king said, his voice carrying the warmth and authority that had characterized his public speaking throughout his life. The greeting was simple, direct, and utterly unexpected in the context of a formal guard posting. James felt a shock of recognition run through him, but his training held firm. He could not respond or even acknowledge the greeting without potentially compromising his duties. The king seemed to understand this perfectly. Having grown up surrounded by military protocol and ceremonial duty, he was well aware of the constraints under which the guard was operating. What he did next, however, caught everyone present completely off guard, and would become the subject of countless retellings in the months and years that followed. "I know you cannot respond while on duty," King Charles continued, his tone conversational and genuinely warm, "but I wanted you to know that I see you, not just as a guard or a uniform, but as a person who has chosen to serve something greater than himself." The words hung in the morning air, carrying a weight and significance that transcended the usual formal exchanges between monarch and military personnel. James felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes, but his discipline held firm. The king's words had touched something deep within him, acknowledging not just his service but his humanity, in a way that formal military recognition rarely did. This wasn't about medals or commendations, this was about one person, recognizing the sacrifice and dedication of another. Detective Inspector Williams felt her own throat tighten as she witnessed this extraordinary moment. In her years of royal protection service, she had seen many formal ceremonies and official recognitions, but this spontaneous acknowledgement of individual service felt more meaningful than any of them. The king's ability to see and honor the person behind the uniform was exactly why she had dedicated her career to protecting the royal family. The king stepped slightly closer, though still maintaining an appropriate distance for the guard's duties. "I've been doing this job for a while now," he said, a hint of gentle humor in his voice. "And I've learned that the people who truly understand service are those who do it quietly, day after day, without recognition or fanfare. You represent the very best of what service means." The small group of castle staff and security personnel who had witnessed this interaction stood in respectful silence, recognizing that they were seeing something remarkable. The king's words weren't just polite formalities. They carried the genuine appreciation of someone who understood the weight of duty and the sacrifice that service required. Michael Harrison, the private secretary, made a discreet note on his tablet. Recognizing that this moment would likely become part of the oral history of royal service, the spontaneous nature of the king's recognition, and the genuine emotion behind his words, represented exactly the kind of personal leadership that had characterized King Charles's approach to the monarchy. The king continued his unexpected address to the motionless guard. "I know something about duty and service, about standing in positions where you represent something larger than yourself. The difference is that when I do it, there are cameras and crowds and recognition. When you do it, there's just dedication and honor and the quiet satisfaction of doing your job well." James felt his chest swell with pride, though no external sign of his emotion was visible. The king's words captured exactly why he had chosen military service: the desire to be part of something meaningful, to serve something greater than his own interests, to stand as a guardian for values and traditions that mattered. To have this recognized by the sovereign himself was almost overwhelming. The king paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. What he said next would surprise everyone present, and would challenge conventional understanding of how monarchs interact with their subjects. It was a moment that would humanize both the crown and the individual who wore it, revealing the man behind the title in a way that formal ceremonies never could. "You know," King Charles said, his voice taking on a more personal tone, "when I was about your age, I stood at attention for hours during various ceremonies, wondering if anyone really understood what we were all doing there. I often felt invisible, like I was just part of the scenery, rather than a person with thoughts and feelings and dreams of my own." The admission was startling in its honesty and vulnerability. Here was the King of England sharing a moment of personal reflection with a guard who couldn't respond, creating an intimacy that transcended their vastly different stations in life. Detective Inspector Williams exchanged a glance with Michael Harrison, both recognizing the extraordinary nature of what they were witnessing. "The truth is," the king continued, "I still sometimes feel that way. The difference is that I've learned to value the moments when someone sees me as a person rather than just a title or a role. And I want you to know that I see you the same way. Behind that uniform is someone who made a choice to serve, who probably has a family somewhere who worries about him, who has hopes and dreams beyond this courtyard." James felt a tear escape and roll down his cheek, though his posture remained perfect. The king's words had touched something profound in him, the recognition that his service was seen and valued not just institutionally, but personally. This wasn't about ceremony or tradition. This was about one human being acknowledging that sacrifice and dedication of another. The morning sun had climbed higher now, warming the ancient stones of Windsor Castle and creating a golden glow around this impromptu gathering. The king seemed to sense that his words were having exactly the impact he had hoped for, and he prepared to deliver what would become the most memorable part of this entire encounter. What King Charles said next would not only surprise everyone present, but would also challenge conventional expectations about royal protocol, personal connection, and the true meaning of service in the modern monarchy. King Charles looked directly into James's eyes, and what he said next would echo through the corridors of Windsor Castle and beyond for years to come. "I want you to know that when your shift ends today, I would be honored if you would join me for tea, not as a guardsman reporting to his king, but as one person who understands service talking to another." The invitation hung in the morning air like something from a fairy tale. Detective Inspector Williams felt her eyebrows raise involuntarily. This was completely unprecedented in her experience of royal protocol. Michael Harrison's fingers froze over his tablet, unsure whether to record this extraordinary breach of conventional procedure or to somehow discourage it. The small group of witnesses stood in stunned silence. Processing the magnitude of what they had just heard, James felt his world tilt on its axis. The King of England had just invited him, a working-class lad from Wales, to tea. Not a formal military briefing, not an official recognition ceremony, but a personal conversation between two people who shared an understanding of duty and service. The surreal nature of the moment made it feel almost dreamlike, except for the very real presence of the king standing before him. The king seemed to understand the shock his invitation had caused, both in the guard and in his accompanying staff. He turned slightly toward Michael Harrison and said quietly, "Please arrange for guardsmen, He paused, Realizing he didn't know the young soldier's name, Lance Corporal Mitchell, "Your Majesty," Detective Inspector Williams supplied quietly. Having memorized the details of all personnel on duty, "Please arrange for Lance Corporal Mitchell to join me in the Oak Room at 4 o'clock this afternoon, after his shift concludes," the king continued. "In formal dress, and please ensure he understands this is not a command performance, but a genuine invitation that he's free to decline if he wishes." Michael Harrison nodded, still processing the unprecedented nature of the request. In his 15 years of organizing royal schedules, he had never been asked to arrange a private tea between the monarch and an individual guardsman based solely on a spontaneous encounter. The logistical and security considerations alone would require careful coordination, but he could see the genuine intent in His Majesty's expression. The king turned back to James, who was still maintaining his rigid posture, despite the emotional turmoil the invitation had created. "Lance Corporal Mitchell," he said formally, "you are not required to respond now, but I hope you'll consider accepting. I find that some of the most valuable conversations I have are with people who understand what it means to put duty before personal comfort." James wanted desperately to respond, to express his gratitude and amazement, but his training held firm. He could not break his ceremonial bearing, no matter how extraordinary the circumstances. The king seemed to understand this perfectly, and nodded approvingly at the young soldier's discipline. "Your dedication to duty, even in this remarkable situation, tells me everything I need to know about your character," King Charles observed. "I'll look forward to our conversation this afternoon, assuming you choose to accept." With that, the king prepared to continue his morning walk, but he paused for one final observation that would resonate with James for the rest of his life. "You know, Lance Corporal, people often ask me what I'm most proud of in my role as king. The answer isn't the ceremonies or the state occasions or the formal recognitions. It's moments like this, when I get to meet someone who embodies the very best of what service means." As the king's entourage began to move away, Detective Inspector Williams lingered for just a moment, studying James's face. She had seen many interactions between royalty and military personnel over her career, but this one was different. The genuine emotion she had witnessed from both the king and the guard suggested something profound had occurred, something that transcended the usual formalities of royal duty. James remained at his post, but his internal world had been completely transformed. The morning that had begun as routine guard duty had become the most significant day of his military career, and quite possibly of his entire life. The king's words kept echoing in his mind, particularly the recognition that behind his uniform was a real person with hopes and dreams and family. As word of the king's unprecedented invitation began to spread quietly through the castle staff, reactions ranged from amazement to concern about protocol. The royal household was accustomed to carefully planned interactions, background checks, and formal procedures. The spontaneous nature of this invitation represented a complete departure from normal practices. Lady Catherine Morrison, the king's equerry, was summoned to help coordinate the afternoon's unusual addition to the royal schedule. Upon hearing the details, she initially expressed concern about security protocols and proper procedures. However, when Michael Harrison explained the genuine emotion and intent behind the king's invitation, she recognized that this was exactly the kind of personal leadership that defined King Charles's approach to the monarchy. Meanwhile, James continued his guard duty with outward discipline but inward excitement. Fellow guards during the shift change noticed nothing unusual in his bearing or performance, but James felt as though he was floating through his remaining hours on duty. The prospect of sitting down for a personal conversation with the king seemed both thrilling and terrifying, as news of the invitation filtered through appropriate military channels. James's commanding officer, Major Timothy Rothwell, was contacted to ensure proper procedures were followed. Major Rothwell's initial reaction was one of disbelief, followed by careful verification that the invitation was genuine and had indeed come from the king himself. In 30 years of military service, Major Rothwell would later tell colleagues, "I've never heard of anything quite like this. The king doesn't just invite individual guardsmen to tea based on a morning encounter. This young man must have made quite an impression." The afternoon hours seemed to crawl by for James as he completed his guard duty. Every minute felt like an hour, as he contemplated the extraordinary opportunity that awaited him. What does one talk about with the King of England? How does a working-class soldier from Wales converse with someone who has spent his entire life in the rarefied world of royalty and privilege? As his shift finally neared its end, James began to feel the weight of nervousness settling on his shoulders. The initial excitement of the invitation was giving way to anxiety about making a good impression, about representing his unit and his background appropriately, about living up to whatever expectations the king might have formed during their brief encounter. Detective Inspector Williams had spent the intervening hours coordinating with castle security to ensure that the afternoon tea could proceed safely while maintaining the informal atmosphere the king had clearly desired. The Oak Room was one of the king's preferred private spaces, smaller and more intimate than the formal reception rooms, with comfortable furniture and a view of the castle gardens. At 3:45 p.m., James Mitchell, now dressed in his civilian clothes and feeling somewhat disoriented without his uniform, was escorted through corridors of Windsor Castle that he had never seen before. The grandeur was overwhelming: paintings by master artists, furniture that was centuries old, and an atmosphere of history that seemed to permeate every stone and timber. As James approached the oak room, his escort, a kindly gentleman usher named Charles Fitzgerald, offered some gentle advice. His Majesty asked specifically that this be treated as an informal conversation, he said quietly. He's genuinely interested in getting to know you as a person. Just be yourself. And King Charles rose from his chair as James entered the oak room, immediately putting the young soldier at ease with his warm smile and relaxed demeanor. The king was dressed casually, in a comfortable sweater and slacks, looking more like a distinguished gentleman than the sovereign of the United Kingdom. The room itself was cozy and inviting, with afternoon sunlight streaming through tall windows and the gentle sounds of the castle gardens drifting in from outside. Lance Corporal Mitchell, the king said, extending his hand for a firm handshake. Thank you for accepting my invitation. I'm genuinely delighted you decided to join me. The informality of the greeting helped ease some of James's nervousness, though he was still acutely aware of the extraordinary nature of the situation. Your Majesty, James replied, his voice steady despite his racing heart, the honor is entirely mine. I'm still not quite sure this is really happening. The king laughed, a genuine sound that filled the room with warmth. I understand completely. I sometimes feel the same way about my own life. Please, sit down. Make yourself comfortable. I've asked for some proper tea and biscuits, nothing too formal, just a chance for us to talk. As they settled into comfortable armchairs positioned near the window, James found himself gradually relaxing. The king's manner was so genuinely welcoming and interested that it became easier to forget the vast difference in their stations and focus on the human connection the king had clearly intended to create. Tell me about yourself, James, the king said, using the guard's first name naturally and without pretension. I know you're with the Coldstream Guards, but I'd like to know about the person behind the uniform. Where are you from? What brought you to military service? James found himself opening up about his childhood in Wales, his grandfather's war stories, and his decision to enlist. The king listened with genuine attention, asking thoughtful questions and making observations that showed he understood the challenges of working-class life and the significance of choosing military service as a path to something greater. My grandfather used to say that service wasn't about glory or recognition, James shared, his initial nervousness giving way to genuine conversation. He said it was about standing up when standing up was needed, even when nobody was watching. That idea really stayed with me. King Charles nodded thoughtfully. Your grandfather sounds like a wise man. That understanding of service, the quiet, unglamorous kind that happens when nobody's watching, that's becoming increasingly rare in our world. It's one of the reasons I wanted to talk with you today. The tea service arrived, wheeled in discreetly by castle staff, who seemed almost invisible in their efficiency. The king served the tea himself, another gesture that reinforced the informal nature of their meeting. As they sipped their tea, the conversation flowed naturally from James's background to broader topics about service, duty, and the challenges of modern military life. I have to admit, the king said, settling back in his chair, that I sometimes wonder if young people today truly understand what service means. Then I meet someone like you, and I'm reminded that each generation produces individuals who get it, who understand that some things are worth dedicating your life to. James felt emboldened by the king's openness to share some of his own observations. If I may say so, Your Majesty, I think many young people want to serve something meaningful, but they're not always sure what that looks like or how to find it. The military gave me structure and purpose, but it also gave me the chance to be part of something bigger than myself. The king's eyes lit up with interest. That's exactly what I hoped to hear. You see, James, I've been thinking a lot lately about how the monarchy needs to evolve to remain relevant and meaningful to people, like you, people who choose service not because they have to, but because they want to make a difference. What followed was an extraordinary conversation that lasted nearly 2 hours, covering topics from the challenges of modern leadership to the importance of maintaining traditions while embracing necessary change. The king shared insights about his own struggles with public service, the weight of responsibility, and his hopes for the future of the British monarchy. You know, King Charles said at one point, people often assume that being born into this role means it comes naturally, but the truth is that real leadership, the kind that actually matters, has to be earned every day. It's not about titles or ceremony, it's about connecting with people and understanding what they need from their institutions. James found himself offering perspectives on how the monarchy was viewed by ordinary service members and working-class families. His honesty and insight clearly resonated with the king, who seemed genuinely interested in understanding how royal leadership could better serve the needs of contemporary Britain. The men and women I serve with, James explained, they respect tradition and ceremony, but what really matters to them is authenticity. They want to know that the people they're serving actually understand and appreciate what they're sacrificing. When you stopped to talk with me this morning, that meant more than any formal ceremony could. The king leaned forward in his chair, clearly engaged by James's perspective. That's exactly what I suspected. People can sense authenticity, and they can also sense when they're being treated as props or symbols rather than as real human beings. I want to be the kind of king who sees and values the person, not just the role they play. As their conversation continued, it became clear that both men were learning from each other. The king gained insights into how his leadership was perceived by ordinary citizens, while James developed a deeper understanding of the challenges and responsibilities that came with constitutional monarchy in the modern era. "I have an idea," King Charles said as their tea began to cool. "Would you be interested in helping me understand how to better connect with service members and their families? Not in any official capacity, but as someone who could offer honest feedback and perspective when I'm planning public engagements or considering new initiatives." James was stunned by the suggestion. "Your Majesty, I'm just a lance corporal. I'm not sure I'm qualified to advise on royal policy." "James," the king said firmly, "you're exactly the person I need advice from. You understand service from the ground up. You've made personal sacrifices for something you believe in, and you have the honesty to tell me things that courtiers and advisors might not. That kind of perspective is invaluable." The offer represented something unprecedented in modern royal practice: an ongoing informal relationship between the monarch and an ordinary service member, based on mutual respect and shared understanding of what duty and service really meant. As their meeting began to wind down, King Charles made one more observation that would stick with James for years to come. "You know, James, I've met with heads of state, Nobel Prize winners, and celebrated leaders from every walk of life. But some of my most meaningful conversations have been with people like you, individuals, who understand that real greatness comes from doing your job well, treating people with respect, and serving something larger than yourself." James left Windsor Castle that afternoon with his world fundamentally changed. The young man who had started his shift as an anonymous guard had ended his day as someone the King of England considered worth knowing personally. More importantly, he had discovered that leadership and service created connections that transcended social class, wealth, or station in life. The king, meanwhile, felt energized by the conversation in a way that formal royal duties rarely achieved. He had been reminded of why his role mattered and had found in James Mitchell an example of the kind of character and commitment that gave him hope for the future of both the monarchy and the nation. It served neither man. 6 months after their first meeting, James Mitchell found himself in an extraordinary position that would have been unimaginable to him just a year earlier. The king had been true to his word about seeking James's perspective on royal engagements, and their informal advisory relationship had evolved into something that was quietly revolutionizing how the monarchy approached public service and community connection. James had been invited to observe several royal visits and ceremonies, offering feedback from the perspective of ordinary citizens and service members. His insights had proven invaluable in helping the king understand how royal appearances were perceived by the people they were meant to serve. More importantly, his honest assessments had helped identify ways to make these engagements more meaningful and authentic. The transformation in James's own life had been equally remarkable. While he remained a serving soldier with the Coldstream Guards, his unique relationship with the king had opened doors to experiences and opportunities he could never have imagined. He had been invited to private functions at the palace, introduced to senior military officers and government officials, and had even been asked to speak at military academies about service and leadership. But perhaps the most significant change was in James himself. The confidence he had gained from knowing that his perspectives were valued by the highest levels of leadership had transformed him from a competent but relatively ordinary soldier into someone recognized throughout his regiment as a natural leader and thoughtful strategist. Major Timothy Rothwell had noticed the change in James immediately. "There's something different about Mitchell," he had observed to his fellow officers. "He's always been a good soldier, but now he carries himself with a confidence and insight that suggests he understands the bigger picture of what we're all doing here." Whatever happened during that tea with His Majesty clearly had a profound impact. The impact extended beyond James personally, to the entire Coldstream Guards regiment, and eventually to other units. Throughout the British military, word of the king's personal attention to an individual guardsman had spread through military circles, creating a sense that their service was seen and valued at the highest levels in ways that went beyond formal ceremonies and official recognition. Had been careful not to abuse his unique position or to seek special treatment. If anything, he had become more dedicated to his regular duties and more supportive of his fellow soldiers. He understood that he had been given an extraordinary opportunity to represent the experiences and perspectives of ordinary service members, and he took that responsibility seriously. The king, meanwhile, had found in James exactly the kind of honest advisor he had hoped for. James's background and ongoing military service gave him credibility with working-class audiences and military families that traditional courtiers simply couldn't match. More importantly, his willingness to offer candid feedback had helped the king avoid several potential missteps in public appearances and policy announcements. 1. particular incident had demonstrated the value of James's perspective perfectly. The king had been planning a visit to a military base to recognize soldiers returning from overseas deployment. The original plan, developed by palace staff, focused on formal ceremonies and official presentations. James had respectfully suggested that what the soldiers and their families really wanted was informal time with the king, opportunities to share their experiences, and recognition of the sacrifices made by military families. The revised visit, incorporating James's suggestions, had been one of the most successful royal engagements in recent memory. Instead of stilted formal presentations, the king had spent hours in genuine conversation with soldiers and their families, hearing their stories and expressing authentic appreciation for their service. The media coverage had been overwhelmingly positive, but more importantly, the soldiers and families involved had felt truly seen and valued. Detective Inspector Sarah Williams, who had witnessed the original encounter between the king and James at Windsor Castle, had watched the evolution of their relationship with professional interest and personal admiration. "I've never seen anything quite like it," she confided to a colleague. "His Majesty has always been committed to authentic engagement, but having someone like Mitchell as a sounding board has taken that commitment to an entirely new level." The relationship had also influenced the king's approach to other aspects of royal duty. James's insights into how working-class families viewed monarchy and tradition had helped inform speeches, policy positions, and public statements. The king had begun incorporating language and perspectives that resonated with ordinary citizens in ways that traditional royal communications rarely achieved. One evening, during one of their regular private conversations, the king shared with James how profoundly their relationship had affected his understanding of leadership. "You've taught me something that years of constitutional education never could," the king told him. "Real leadership isn't about maintaining distance or projecting authority. It's about creating genuine connections with people who share your values, regardless of their background or station." James had been equally transformed by their ongoing relationship. "Your Majesty," he replied, "what you've shown me is that service looks the same whether you're wearing a crown or carrying a rifle. It's about putting the needs of others before your own comfort, and doing what's right even when it's difficult." The king had begun implementing what palace staff quietly referred to as the Mitchell approach to royal engagements. Instead of relying solely on traditional advisors and protocol experts, he increasingly sought input from people who actually lived the experiences he was trying to understand and support. This had led to more authentic and impactful public appearances across a wide range of issues and communities. The success of this approach had not gone unnoticed within royal circles and government departments. Senior officials had begun consulting with James on matters related to military morale, veteran support, and public perception of royal initiatives. His unique position as someone who understood both the realities of military service and the workings of royal decision-making made him an invaluable bridge between these two worlds. James's commanding officers had also recognized the broader value of his insights. Major Rothwell had begun including James in planning sessions for ceremonial duties and public events, knowing that his perspective could help ensure these occasions achieved their intended impact. This had led to improvements in how the military presented itself to the public and how ceremonial traditions were explained and contextualized for modern audiences. The ripple effects extended even further. Other members of the royal family had begun seeking James's input on their own public engagements, particularly those involving military or working-class communities. His ability to anticipate how different audiences would respond to various approaches had made him an unofficial consultant on royal communications strategy, but perhaps the most significant development was the king's decision to formalize what had begun as an informal advisory relationship. James was offered a unique position within the royal household, serving as a liaison between the monarchy and the military community. The role would allow him to continue his military service, while also providing ongoing advice and feedback on royal initiatives. The position represented something entirely new in the modern monarchy, a formal advisory role for someone from an ordinary background, whose value came not from traditional credentials or social connections, but from authentic experience and honest insight. It was exactly the kind of innovation that King Charles had envisioned. When he first decided to break protocol and invite a young guardsman to tea, James's acceptance of the position marked the beginning of what historians would later recognize as a significant evolution in how the British monarchy approached public service and community engagement. The success of the king's relationship with James demonstrated that authentic leadership required authentic advisors, people who understood the experiences and perspectives of the communities the monarchy served. The announcement of James's new role was made quietly, without fanfare or extensive media attention. The king had insisted that the position should be about substance rather than publicity. focused on improving royal service rather than generating headlines. This approach reflected the values that had brought the king and James together. In the first place, a shared commitment to doing meaningful work regardless of recognition or acclaim. James prepared to take on his expanded responsibilities. He reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought him from a guard post at Windsor Castle to a formal advisory role within the royal household. The young man who had once stood at attention while the king observed him had become someone whose opinions were valued and whose insights helped shape royal policy. The king, meanwhile, had found validation for his belief that the monarchy's future lay in authentic connections with ordinary citizens, who embodied the best values of service and dedication. James Mitchell had proven that wisdom and insight could be found in unexpected places, and that meaningful leadership required listening to voices that might otherwise go unheard. Their relationship had also demonstrated something important about the nature of service itself, that regardless of station or circumstance, people who chose to serve something greater than themselves shared common values and understanding that transcended social barriers. The connection between a king and a guardsman had revealed universal truths about duty, honor, and the importance of treating every person with dignity and respect. As James settled into his new role, he carried with him the knowledge that he had been given an extraordinary opportunity to represent not just military personnel, but all ordinary citizens who chose service over self. The responsibility was daunting, but it was also inspiring, knowing that his voice could help ensure that royal leadership remained connected to the real experiences and needs of the people it served. 2 years after that transformative morning at Windsor Castle, James Mitchell stood in the same courtyard where his extraordinary journey had begun. But this time his perspective was entirely different. He was no longer the anonymous guard hoping to serve with honor. He had become Lieutenant James Mitchell, the first person in British royal history to hold the formal title of Military Community Liaison to His Majesty the King. The position had been created specifically to institutionalize the insights and approach that James had brought to royal service. His success in advising the king had demonstrated the value of having authentic voices from military and working class communities directly involved in royal decisions, rather than filtered through traditional courtiers and establishment figures. James's influence on royal policy and public engagement had been profound and measurable. Public approval ratings for the king had reached historic highs, particularly among military families and working-class communities who felt, for the first time in generations, that the monarchy truly understood and valued their experiences. The authenticity that James helped bring to royal communications had resonated far beyond the military, touching families throughout Britain who saw their own values reflected in the king's approach to service and leadership. The success had not gone unnoticed by other members of the royal family or by government officials. James found himself consulted on matters ranging from veterans policy to community development programs. His unique position as someone who understood both the realities of ordinary life and the workings of high-level government had made him an invaluable bridge between these often disconnected worlds, but the impact extended far beyond policy and public relations. James's presence in royal circles had inspired a broader cultural shift within the monarchy itself. Other staff members, from security personnel to household workers, reported feeling more valued and heard. The king's example of genuinely listening to and learning from people regardless of their position had created a more inclusive and authentic environment throughout the royal household. The changes were visible in countless small ways. Royal visits were now planned with much greater attention to the actual needs and interests of the communities being served. Public statements incorporated language and perspectives that resonated with ordinary citizens. Most importantly, the monarchy had developed a reputation for authenticity and genuine care that distinguished it from the more formal and distant approach of previous generations. James's own transformation had been equally remarkable. The young man who had once worried about representing his working-class background appropriately in royal circles had become a confident and respected advisor whose insights were sought by some of the most powerful people in Britain. His success had proven that authentic experience and honest perspective could be more valuable than traditional credentials or social connections. The king had often remarked privately that his relationship with James had taught him more about effective leadership than decades of formal preparation for the throne. James showed me that real authority comes from understanding and serving the people you're responsible for. The king had told his private secretary, everything else is just ceremony and tradition. The relationship had also influenced how the king approached his constitutional duties. His speeches to Parliament now included perspectives and language that reflected the experiences of ordinary citizens in ways that previous monarchs had rarely achieved. His interactions with prime ministers and government officials were informed by insights from communities that had traditionally been excluded from high-level political discussions. James's influence was particularly evident in the king's approach to military and veterans issues. Royal patronage of military charities had become more strategic and effective, focusing on programs that actually addressed the needs identified by service members and their families rather than simply maintaining traditional ceremonial relationships. The king's public statements on defense and security issues carried an authenticity and understanding that reflected real knowledge of military life and sacrifice. The international impact had been significant as well. Other monarchies and heads of state had taken note of King Charles's success in connecting with ordinary citizens and had begun seeking similar, authentic voices in their own advisory circles. James had been invited to speak at international conferences on leadership and public service, sharing insights about the importance of including diverse perspectives in decision processes. But perhaps the most meaningful aspect of James's journey was how it had inspired others throughout the military and beyond. Young service members now had an example of how authentic character and commitment to service could open doors and create opportunities regardless of background. The message that every person's perspective had value, if expressed thoughtfully and honestly, it resonated throughout British society. James had also become a mentor to other service members, helping them develop the confidence and communication skills necessary to contribute meaningfully to discussions about policy and leadership. His success had created pathways for other authentic voices to be heard in circles where they had previously been excluded. The king had formalized this mentoring role by establishing what became known as the Community Voice Initiative, which created structured opportunities for people from various backgrounds, military, education, healthcare, and other public service sectors to provide input on royal programs and government policies. James had been instrumental in designing and implementing this program, ensuring it maintained the authenticity and effectiveness that had characterized his own relationship with the king. On the second anniversary of their first meeting, the king and James held a private conversation in the same oak room where their initial tea had taken place. The comfortable chairs were the same, the afternoon sunlight still streamed through the tall windows, but both men had been fundamentally changed by their relationship and its broader impact. James the king said, "When I stopped to speak with you that morning, I was following an instinct that your character and dedication deserved recognition. I had no idea we were beginning something that would transform how I approach my entire role as king." James, now comfortable with the informal relationship they had developed, smiled and replied, "Your Majesty, you saw something in me that I didn't even know was there. But more importantly, you showed me that service really is the same whether you're wearing a crown or standing guard. It's about using whatever position you have to make things better for other people." The king nodded thoughtfully. "What we've learned together is that authentic leadership requires authentic advisors. The monarchy's future depends not on maintaining distance from ordinary citizens, but on creating genuine connections with people who embody the values we're supposed to serve." Their conversation turned to the future and the legacy they hoped their relationship would create. Both men understood that they had demonstrated something important about the possibility for meaningful connections across social barriers when those connections were based on shared values and mutual respect. James had recently been approached about writing a book about his experiences, and several universities had offered him positions teaching leadership and public service. While honored by these opportunities, he remained committed to his unique role within the royal household, understanding that his continued service in this position represented something valuable that shouldn't be abandoned for personal advancement. "I've learned that real impact comes from consistency and commitment," James explained to the king. "What we've built together works because it's genuine and because it's sustained. I want to make sure that the pathways we've created for authentic voices remain open for others who might not otherwise be heard." The king had come to the same conclusion about the importance of institutionalizing the changes they had implemented. "Our relationship has proven that the monarchy can be both traditional and innovative, both respectful of history and responsive to contemporary needs. That balance is essential for the institution's future relevance." As their anniversary conversation concluded, both men reflected on how a simple moment of human recognition had grown into something that had influenced royal policy, inspired organizational change, and demonstrated the power of authentic leadership. The young guardsman, who had once stood at attention while the king observed him, had become a partner in reimagining what modern monarchy could accomplish when it remained connected to the values and experiences of the people it served. A story that had begun with an unexpected conversation had evolved into a model for leadership that transcended the monarchy itself, proving that when people of character and commitment come together around shared values, they can create changes that benefit everyone they serve. James Mitchell and King Charles III had shown that the most powerful transformations often begin with a simple recognition that every person's dignity and perspective deserves respect and attention, regardless of their station in life.